Welcome back, everyone, to Red Spotlight. I'm Alexis, and this is the podcast that brings you everything coming out of the world of movies and more. And we're going to change things up a little bit this week. As you may see, nobody else is here, and there's actually a very good reason for that. I didn't want them here. I don't need them here. They've already said what they had to say about what we're discussing today, and they quite possibly don't really care to really talk about it ever again. So, yeah, it's gonna be me, and I'm gonna be talking to you literally about a film that I can't really get out of my head, one that I've kind of been parsing through, and it's not the same one that all of you are digging right now. Today we're talking about a film that is not The Odyssey, although the film is great, and we'll have our own show with the other people that are on this usual program, and they'll come on and they'll have the usual thing where we'll talk about how an amazing director Nolan is and what an amazing film he made. Great. We're going to have our time for that. Don't worry about it. But it's interesting. I did see The Odyssey, and it is a great film. But it kind of made me think about this other movie that in some ways is really having a conversation with, and it's also kind of been a film that I've not really been able to shake for a lot of reasons. And it's also a film that nobody else really on this podcast cared for, and quite frankly, a lot of people flat out hate it and despise, reviled, and laughed at. So the people who know me well already know which film it is, so they can leave, which I'm not even sure they would ever click on a video if they knew it was just me, but here we are. Anyway, thank you all for coming here today on this lovely podcast, and today we're going to be talking a lot more in depth about the film Disclosure Day by Steven Spielberg, which has been out for a little over a month now. I've seen it so many times, and every time I see it, there's more that I kind of come away with, and I have a pretty good suspicion that I'm going to be defending this film probably till the end of my days, and I know that, like with every other Spielberg film, it's just going to get higher in estimation, not just for myself, but for a lot of people. And I actually brought a lot of clips with me today. That way I'm not the only voice you hear, and that way it gives me time to pause, because it's a lot to consistently just talk for a whole hour through. And then I also have some interesting pieces, written pieces. Wow, I actually read for interestingly enough, I do. But I just feel like there's a lot about the film that moved quite a few people, and I wanted to share that. This is a film that, for a couple of weeks now, over a month now, I've kind of been trying to make up my mind about, ultimately what is it about it that is stirring something in me, and it very clearly is. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I don't see a lot of the flaws that people have with the movie. I understand what people are coming away with perfectly and what their issues are. I just don't feel the same way really about any of that. And I mean, people should know at this point, I'm no stranger to being in this particular scenario. So, I already kind of expected it would be this way. So here we are again. But no, I think it's an interesting film to talk about in quite a few ways. And I think if there's a place I wanted to begin with is a couple of things that you should know about me and what I bring to the table about this film. I really am just maybe the biggest fan of Steven Spielberg in ways that a lot of people just are not anymore these days. I love the entirety of his filmography. And do I love every single movie? No. I think there are some films in there that are they missed the mark to an extreme degree. But for, I would say, maybe 7 or 8 of his movies out of 35, the rest I quite vibe with, and some I quite love. And I've had the privilege of doing a rewatch of the entire filmography of his before watching this one, and it just, reminded me that this is just my guy. The sensibilities that he has as far as a filmmaker, the craft that he brings to it, but also the humanity that he brings to all of the stories. I find a kinship with him in literally even just the more primal senses of how, he was brought up. He was brought up, he was born in the 50s, brought up in the 60s. What would I have in common with him? Well, he has never really been able to get over the fact of how he was a lonely kid that also was easily frightened of things. That really, why? Why would he be frightened of some things? And I share that so much with him that I experienced that too. That's why E.T. particularly is a film that hit hard then and still continues to hit hard now. Um, as does so many of the other films that he makes. But Sean Fanesi pointed this out on the Big Picture podcast that there's a certain sense of one of the many themes that he comes back to in so many of his movies is loneliness, and that's something that I very much could relate to. Um, Even as far as like something he revealed lately, he was on the Michelle Obama podcast, which the only reason I even listened to that was because he was on there. But he even shared that he's kind of been getting crazy in recent years with his iPhone and kind of like documenting literally anything and everything, and not just with his family, but then also with like his film family and the crew and cast that are on his various pictures. He'll just like take out his phone and just start making mini movies or just like capturing moments. And those people that know me best would already know that's just literally the role that I take on when I'm at any social setting, especially when it comes to like my close family. I've literally been approached by individual members of this large extended group that have like really singled me out and said, you know what, thank you so much for being that guy that's just there documenting all of this, because if it wasn't for you, we wouldn't have all these wonderful memories to look back on. And that's just something that I do it for that very very reason. But to me, it's I learned in the last 10 years that you know I had a very early interest in photography, yes, but once I had a smartphone and I was like recording videos, and also the fact that I've been recording literally videos like this for like 10 years now, it just kind of became more apparent to me that videos help get a better sense of a memory than a picture does. And so that's again just I keep finding ways in which I can like connect with him as a person. But then there's another element to understanding me and then my relationship with him as a director, as a person, then also with this movie in particular. It happens to be in some ways it's dressed in the themes of aliens or the storylines of aliens. And that's always just been something that's interested me. And I've on this show have said many times that it's just one of the fascinations that sometimes you have as a kid, where you're like, what, aliens, and what does that mean for us, and are they really out there? And there was a particular period, I think it was when I was a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old, I was just like really in it, just looking at all these different like documented like experiences that people would have, or they would claim to have with extraterrestrials. And it always just kind of made sense to me that there would be something out there in the vastness of the universe. So the idea that here we are again with this director who I already have such a connection with on various amounts of levels. Oh, he has this fascination, and now he's and he's had a particular interesting arc where it's like sometimes he believed, sometimes he didn't, but now it's wrapped all the way around where he's just like, no, he's convinced they're out there, they're real, and they may already be here. And he was so moved by that reality, or his reality, that he's like, okay, you know what, I gotta go and make a movie about this. So there's just already a lot of baked in interest in anything he does, and a lot of the films that he has made that I've really responded to, that again, it's just like it's one of those special recipes where it's like, man, this was kind of like really made in the lab, like for me. And I think it's just really cool. Like I don't really get to have too many of those all that often. So yeah, this was a really interesting thing in the lead up to it, because we also are kind of like thinking to ourselves, okay, well, what is there left to do and say? And that's kind of, I think, a perfect place to begin this conversation, really, in as far as how the movie is being received, which I mentioned at the top, a lot of people are just like not really vibing with the film and picking it apart and just like laughing at it. There was a story I remember reading about in some I think journalists tweet or something. They were at like a screening the same week that Disclosure Day premiered, and he was saying that he had never seen anything like it. Where while there were, I think it was either before or after the screening for this different movie had happened, they were literally all like doing this hubbub or like huddling up of like, exchanging notes and how they would have improved it here and there, and like dismissing it and laughing at it. And it's like, well, yeah, I think that's a pretty good case that something in this film was really inspiring some level of, well, a lot of cynicism, but a lot of anger and hatred, clearly. But that's the thing about this project that is quite interesting, as far as like, and that why I'm including the whole angle of how it's being received, because having seen the film, and those who have seen the movie, I think they can understand very easily. This really was a Herculean effort to be able to get anyone to be interested in this, because, quite frankly, this movie is not really about aliens. It's like it uses that as, I guess a little bit of the hook, but in a lot of ways, and I think those that really responded to the film, and even those that didn't, I think quite concur. Maybe that's part of why some did not respond at all to it, because in large part it's not really about what the world would look like if we knew aliens were out there, even though that's literally what Universal used in the marketing and in the trailers to get people interested in this. And look, not for nothing, I don't really blame Universal all that much, or Spielberg or Amblin, because the last two films of his, the public had no interest in watching. They weren't interested in the subject material, even though they were quite rich films as far as, cinema is concerned. But most people just don't have an interest in that. So they have to, with all due respect, they have to find a way to trick you into going into the movie. And so one of the ways that they kind of like were trying to get especially cinephiles invested and interested in watching this movie was to get him to do a promotional tour and going on a whole bunch of different podcasts. He was saying that he had never been on a podcast before. He went on, The Big Picture with the Rewatchables. He went on Michelle Obama's show. He did a whole Neil deGrasse Tyson. Like he was really making the rounds. And I think Universal, they just kind of threw their hands and said, you know what, ultimately, like if it would be nice if you had made the movie that I think they thought that he was making, but the next best thing they could do was to just sell the film on his name. And it got a lot of, I've watched a lot of commentary on the film after the fact. And I even recall, Joanna Robinson of the House of R podcast that was saying, like, look, maybe it was just a mistake on as far as like how little I responded to the movie, because, with this whole like Spielberg is back, Spielberg summer, the fact that it was a summer release and it was about aliens, I think a lot of people really were thinking this was going to be a big action film, or maybe not even an action film, but a big like science fiction traditional blockbuster of sorts that was going to have a lot of popcorn stuff in it, if you will. And like much like a Close Encounters, even though that's not necessarily the or a Raiders, I guess, or an E.T. And this film's not that. It's not trying to be that. And that's part of the problem, I think, is people were really sold in the idea that Spielberg is back, Spielberg summer, we're going to get a War of the Worlds, like a scale of that. And that's not at all what's here, because that's not really the purpose of this. But it was the purpose of the marketing campaign to manipulate people into thinking it would be that. And I can't help but wonder if that's a huge part of why people were so angry coming out of it, in addition to what the movie actually is and what it's saying. And as I said in recent shows, perhaps I would have been curious to see what the response would be if they had moved it over to a fall release, but that's neither here nor there at that point. But that's really curious. And I think one of the clips that I have with me here,
the movie was certainly marketed as a movie about aliens and what if aliens came to Earth. That's not really what the movie's about, right? Like, the movie is very obviously about, like, what happens to you when you're a little kid and why do you become the way that you are and how it haunts you and then maybe solves you or figures you or helps you find a clearer path to your life.
Yeah.
That's a very heady concept. That's not it's not marketable at all. Two, the kind of thing that you say to somebody who hates a movie and they're like, fuck off, which I understand.
That might be generally, I think, a really good, concise way of just saying it all in that instance, which is there's a lot more, I think, of, methodical nature to it. It's a lot of, thematic layers in this movie that, quite frankly, I don't believe a lot of people who would, I think, heard the premise of this movie would be quite interested in exploring, and even the ones that can see them, quite frankly, don't really care, if we're being honest with it. So that's generally the sense, is that this is kind of like, a movie about, wouldn't you imagine it, Steven Spielberg. It is a film that in large part is the next logical thing you would do after you make The Fabelmans. The Fabelmans was a movie that he had been waiting his whole life to really exorcise out of his system, which dealt with who he is, well, that's really what it is, though. He says so much in those interviews. Do you really know who you are all that well? And I think in a lot of ways that film was finding his way to embracing and finding out who he is. And part of that is the events in his life that led him to be that person. His mother and his father, and the end of their marriage, as well as the idea that his other love, the art that he has as a filmmaker and storytelling, were introduced precisely because of who the people that his parents were. And that traumatic event of that marriage collapsing completely, and what that would mean for him. He had been really trying to address that, and he had in small ways in a lot of his movies. But The Fabelmans was something that he really had been dreading, waiting his whole life to do. And when he made that film, in a lot of ways, I think a lot of people consider it to be his best movie. I would even just remind people that I was defending that from literally day one, when we had a similar response when it came out. So much befuddlement, so much confusion, so much, it's a movie, who cares really? And now people are like, you know what, that was kind of like amazing. I just watched a podcast that put it as the #1 movie of his 21st century filmography. So just putting that out there. But when you watch Disclosure Day, in a lot of ways, at least to me, it comes across like The Fabelmans 2, because that film, Disclosure Day, would not be the same without The Fabelmans. I see not like repetitions of the same kind of like sequences, or like, oh, he's just doing the same thing again. It feels like a continuation of some of those themes, and it feels like this film really was the person who came out at the end of that filmmaking process, and him wanting to share that experience with the world in hopes that people could also have that for themselves. It feels like to me that he kind of went through that process. He figured out finally who he was. And in some ways he thinks that, or he feels that, if people can have a similar experience than what he did, to look back at their past, to look back into their memory, to kind of have a bit of a reckoning with who they were as a kid, that perhaps that could be the key to unlocking the empathy inside themselves. Because ultimately, the film isn't about aliens, Disclosure Day. It's about humanity. It's about empathy as a superpower. That's a literal thing that happens in the film with Emily Blunt's character, Margaret Fairchild, being, having the gift of empathy. And it's not a thing that the film or Spielberg himself believes is exclusive to Margaret. It is something that all mankind can have, but we choose to suppress. Our rejection of this understanding, as Hugo says in the film, is leading to our destruction. It's very clear there in the text. And a lot of people, I think, agree with that idea, but they kind of were reviled it in terms of how it was presented here for reasons. But think about like that sense of the movie, that he wants to share this with us. He feels like he understood himself better now because of the experience. He says about what it was like to make a movie that featured his parents after they had both passed away. And when he first saw Michelle Williams and Paul Dano, who played his parents, in full costume for the first time, and how much he just fell apart to pieces. There's a through line from that to one of the key sequences in this film when Emily Blunt has to reckon with her past. And she has to literally relive it and reawaken that memory. And then once that sequence ends, she understands who she really is, who she was meant to be, and her place in the world. I'm sorry, that's just fucking beautiful. Like, it really, like, it spoke to me so deeply that when I was watching it, and every time that I've seen it, I'm just arrested, and I surrender to its absolute beauty. And it also just helps that I'm a person just like Steven is, that is just like, so much, living in memory, and I think about, the kind of experiences that I've had throughout my life, and it also does, I think, really connect with me in large part because of the experiences that I've had later on recently. Now as an adult, I've had to, let's just say, revisit certain places and revisit certain areas of which held such deep trauma for me and shaped so much of my childhood, a lot of negativity in my childhood, and I had to, kind of find my way to being okay to being in those spaces again. And I embraced it. I welcomed the reflections as I usually do. And I was able to come out the other end of it being okay with what happened to me, reconciling with a lot of the loneliness and a lot of the ways that I felt ostracized, and kind of using it as a way to be a better person, to be a better mentor. And I mean, again, I don't think any other living director or filmmaker, I feel understands me better than Spielberg. So, I mean, I know I could talk about this all the time here, but let me go ahead and play another clip that I have from the Blank Check podcast with Griffin and David.
And that's why you got these movies where people went like, Steven Spielberg still seems really hung up about this divorce thing, because it was basically men will become the most successful director in the history of Hollywood to avoid going to therapy. All this time, he's avoiding making the movie about the real thing, which is The Fabelmans. He gets that out of his system. He makes the movie where everyone who works on that is like, he was crying on set all the time. It was a really difficult process. He exercised something from his system, and he's promoting that movie, and he's like, I actually don't know what I make next. To a certain degree, I've been avoiding making this movie my whole career, and I don't know what I have to say. And this is a movie about two people processing trauma. It is a movie about two characters who end up being the ones who can serve to create a catharsis for people at large through reckoning with their own trauma and their own history. Things that they have pointedly just been saying, like, I don't want to fucking think about that shit anymore. I don't need that. I'm fine. I'm functional. That's thing one. Thing two in this movie is Spielberg talks a lot about having his existential crisis during the pandemic, as many of us did. What do I fucking do now? I've just been work, and now I'm slowed down. I can't make movies. If I only make one movie again, what is it? What's the one movie I have to make? Fabelmans, but also really reckoning with the world. And he said he would leave his home and just drive around for hours because he didn't know what to do with himself. And I think what this movie's commenting on is we are living in obviously a very fractured world in which people live in alternate realities, and it's very impossible to get any agreement on anything. Religion is one of these things that's supposed to unify people. It has only pushed people further apart. It has only made things more violent. And we went through this collective trauma of this horrible global pandemic that affected literally everyone on the planet to some degree, and it fractured us even further. And I think he's creating a simulation of, is there anything that could happen a form of communication that actually unified all of humanity for a minute. And I think this movie builds to a note of, and what happens now? The last word of this movie, I believe, is listen.
Of course.
Yeah. And it's sort of like the next step is, what do we say now that we have everyone's attention? Because for one brief moment, for 15 minutes, we have collectively gotten everyone onto the exact same page. There is now a reality that has just adjusted that we all have to understand. And I think it's basically saying there's now something new that's like replacing religion. Not that the aliens will become their own religion, but that part of it is that the Elizabeth Marvel character is someone who's not fighting this, is saying like, this doesn't negate my worldview because my worldview is less about the dogmatic text here than it is about the ideas of what we're trying to get at, which is a unification of empathy, which this movie is about. Like, is there any fucking way that empathy could win again?
Right.
Is there
could we
fucking way that we could all just get on the same page about
do
everything?
This sort of fantasy for
I think that is really the crux of this whole film, and really the whole intended purpose of it is the belief in community, in communion, in us being able to be united by anything all over and ever again. And I do think there are a lot of people that after COVID happened, and you don't have to blame it specifically on that, but it can be, kind of the crack that broke the dam, if you will. But I have said, throughout so many instances that it is really hard, and I understand when people say that it's hard to feel like there could ever be unity again, right? Like, but why wouldn't we want to see it? Why wouldn't we want to hope for it? I think is kind of the, my issue is so many people were kind of insulted. I would think so because of how, extreme that they were reacting to it. Like, this is the thing. When the film is over, it doesn't quite tell you, after they've, done the whole disclosure day, we're not really sure what happens next. But if you really flow with the emotional core of the film, that this universal truth of the universe, which is not that aliens are real, but ultimately what aliens are trying to get us to feel, which is empathy, is that evolutionary advantage that we need, not just to understand ourselves, but to move beyond this rabble. In the background of this film, World War III is literally about to break out. And this whole thing and the plot mechanizations of this film has revealed that long ago, the aliens foresaw this moment. And they imbued two individuals, as David would say, a dyad in the Force. We had Emily Blunt's character, Margaret, and Josh O'Connor's character, Daniel, that were imbued with abilities that were going to be used toward this very moment to broadcast themselves and announce. And then the film literally ends with listen, which says so much. We don't listen to each other. Maybe we should. But I also do think it's kind of ridiculous to think that we can't have moments of unity, because, the film came out at the time that, the New York Knicks won the championship at the NBA. And of course, the World Cup was just starting, and there was so much, joy all over the place. People had some really weird takeaways with like, oh, who watches broadcast news, and why would that be anything anybody would be watching in the first place, or how could that be the outlet in which it would cause? Well, I mean, the film kind of proves you wrong, because a lot of people do still look to traditional news and as when events like these do break, and it matters a lot who is the face on the news. Unfortunately, as the reality of this nation and all nations, but especially in this nation, we have a bunch of dishonest actors who are paid or are fearful of their positions of those news stations, because they work for corporations and they work for CEOs who have no interest in having any kind of like progressive policies, left-leaning democratic social policies that would enact true change. And so they work very much to drone in and hire only people who are friendly to establishment of both political parties. They have their own apparatus and propaganda machine, and they manufacture consent. That's how it's done, unfortunately. And that's why with the use of Courtney Grace at the end of the film and her reacting, she's a character really that's just there at the very end, but part of what makes her presence so powerful in that ending is that she is reacting in real time and she is feeling so much, and how she feels is important because so often is the case that the person giving you the news and how they give it to you and how they communicate it to you and how they look and how they feel and whatever emotion they have can be in many ways transferred onto you, the viewer, the empathy, if you will. And that's kind of why that's there in the first place.
We know Spielberg is an emotional filmmaker, but that final chapter really snuck up on me and hit my emotions before I could even rationalize to myself why, almost like a cinematic magic trick. And that emotional impact, I think, is reflective of the ultimate message behind the movie, which is a call to not let cynicism caused by a mean, calcified, individualized world affect your ability to still take in revelatory information and moments, to instead let yourself be open to optimism and human connection. And I've seen a lot of people say that that feels naive, that this reads as ignorant of the current moment, the current world. But if hopefulness is considered naive, I think we've really lost the plot as a species. And like Brendan mentioned about my assessment of the film, the fact that so many people are having an emotional reaction to the ending and to the film in general, I think proves that we still long for connection, for togetherness, that there is still hope for a joining of humanity if we're willing to allow it.
Okay. Moving over next.
That was Cody Derricks of the NBP podcast, and they had a really wonderful conversation. I do want to plug them. Go listen to their whole breakdown of this film. You know, it's not glowing all the way through, but not that it needs to be, but it is a wonderful, I think, breakdown that I think a lot of people quite miss, and so much of what they had to share about all the different layers of this film, I think, are quite revelatory. But I think that is true. You know, some people just were not letting themselves kind of be taken. They were resisting it for quite reasons here or there. Like I mentioned before, I've seen many clips where people are just clowning on the whole use of traditional media. Oh, that would never happen. That took me out of it. Other people were like, okay, aliens exist. Why would I care? Why does this matter? Or even, but this idea of like, this is never happening again. This is so old fashioned. What an old fashioned notion. I think of Phil Coulson in the Avengers when the aliens are about to basically unload hell on New York, and with what's about to happen, he says to one of them, to Captain America, as a matter of fact, people could use a little old-fashioned. You know, it's interesting, right? Because that's a complete juxtaposition as far as like how people, that's a lot of their main issue with the movie. When you compare it to the Odyssey, and the Odyssey is not really saying all that different, although it's kind of dressed in a lot more. I'm not saying, well, yeah, it is. It's very cynical. It's saying it's over, it's hopeless, it's done. Whereas Disclosure Day is saying it doesn't have to be. We have it within us, and I think, subscribe to that particular thing. But it's interesting how both films, not at all about the same thing on the surface, but if you look deep down, they are in conversation with each other. And I think it's very, very telling that a lot of people from the Odyssey are like, yes, it's over. We suck. We're fucked. It's done. Cinema. As opposed to Disclosure Day, which presented, no, we don't have to think that it can be. Maybe there's a way, and that's the difference here. But then, of course, they all kind of like, as if. But there is not a definitive ending in the sense of what we know happens next, right? Like, it's up to you to kind of like figure out, or kind of like for you to join in this conversation. What do you think happens next? Could it be that this will fix things, or is it only going to make things worse? And I think it's really interesting how, you know, there are a lot of questions that are kind of thrown at you in the film, and it doesn't really answer too much of those. And I feel that's purposeful because it's not really here to answer those questions. I think ultimately this comes from a place of Steven wanting to believe that there could be anything, something that can get us to move beyond ourselves. I do want to go ahead and play another clip from the same podcast here. This is Brendan Hodges, who is, I think, going a little bit more into that particular ending of the movie when we get to that.
Way the characters, the civilians, or I should say the non-main characters, all the sort of supporting cast we see around the world, they're not watching this footage with the Spielberg face. They're not watching it in awe. Compare the faces at the end of this movie to the faces at the end of Close Encounters and E.T. It's night and day. And it's an ambiguity. And I think the film does this really deft thing where it's so clear what Spielberg himself thinks will happen and what he may hope and pray will happen, while creating space in his own film that allows for the ambiguity of what could happen.
Right.
And the screenwriter, David Koepp, he said to Slant that he thinks it would be good in the long run, but he's not as optimistic as Spielberg, and he thinks the world will, dovetail into violence and despair. And a key detail is that the movie has all these dialectics, as we've been saying, on what could happen to belief, to the sense of God, to our moral idea, how people will react in fear or chaos can reign, whatever it happens to be. And the thing about that is the movie never disproves any of those arguments. It never says any of those things are wrong, as a text, I mean. And a lot of people have interpreted the Mother Superior speaking to Jane when she says, oh, you lost your faith in people, not God, or you didn't lose your faith in God, you lost your faith in people. That's explaining Jane's character motivation to go to the news center at the end of the movie. That doesn't mean Jane's right, that she should believe in people, because the movie intentionally withholds that from us. This is the most narratively ambiguous ending of Spielberg's career. You've got AI, you've got Munich that end on a thematically and an emotionally ambiguous note, but this movie ends in total narrative ambiguity. It tees up all these potential eventualities of what could happen, doesn't resolve them, and then says, it's on you to figure it out. And I think that's such a striking and bold thing for Spielberg to do, which also, I must say, makes the marketing even more puzzling, like we said before. But I found that so powerful and so moving and so absorbing. And I could go on and on for this movie. There's so much about it we haven't even touched on yet. I think the ending also works as a celebration of the B movie and the low genres, much like Indiana Jones, where it's taking a genre that was dismissed and then treating it on its own terms.
Right? Because he could have gone with a whole unique design for an alien, but he didn't. He went classical.
Classic.
Yeah,
exactly. And I've seen people say like, oh, I wish the aliens had like a more different design, or like, oh, that was Spielberg's own design. I chatted with Josh about this after the movie.
I don't think it's a mistake that Eve Hewson questions at first if they are people, little children. I think he intentionally wanted them to have human characteristics of arms, legs, eyes, et cetera, because it plays more directly into the themes of the film then of how we are treating each other on this planet. And yes, while these beings may not be from this planet, why should we treat them differently? You know what I mean? And that antagonistic nature that we have towards each other, and maybe we would have towards other beings who would be amongst us, I think is at the core heart of what he is communicating here.
I agree. I also, though, think that it's important. It's the alien. It is not Spielberg's alien. This is what the aliens have looked like in, UFO conspiracy magazines and whatever else since the 50s.
Right.
So he's also celebrating all of that stuff.
So I just have to say that one of the things that I loved about the film, actually, I mean, at this point, I've seen it so many times that I love that whole final sequence and how the particular presentation of with the news clips and the whole feeling of what the world would look like if this actually happened, I do think is kind of where Steven started. Because I do think, like, well, how many years do I have left? Is this ever going to happen? I really do believe that they're out there. I do believe that they mean good. What if I just did it myself anyway? That's what he does with these shots. And I'm just, at that point, look, it's so absorbing. There were many times where I was watching those, like, last, like, 10 minutes where I just completely forgot I was watching a film. Like, legitimately. And then when it ends and they wheel out like the ET and everything, I'm just like holding my breath and just even more than I already was, and just like it's the stuff of dreams. It's the stuff that, again, and maybe this only really works if you have a fascination with these things and you have a hope for whatever it could mean, what you feel it would mean, but just that when you are in the flow, when you surrender to what the film is trying to make you feel, and then as an added bonus, you come at it with this history of already being invested in these creatures, and it's presented to you again as you forget that you're watching a movie. It's so absorbing. It's so beautiful. Just watching people's reactions, just like, are you watching this stuff? And then as he's, with Kilner and with Margaret delivering the message of listen, and then that's it, that's the ending. I know a lot of people are not going to like that because they want everything spoon-fed. They actually thought they were, or in some instances, they thought they were getting the film that would have happened the next day. But that's not really what he's here to do. I love the juxtaposition of, like, the movie opens in the most unusual way at some kind of, like, UFC event or maybe even WWE, when, like, these guys are, like, beating up on each other. There's this wrestler who's just, like, stomping on the camera, and the crowd just, like, numbingly just, like, cheering in unison. And the whole movie happens in the beginning. That was the beginning. It goes all the way to the end when everyone, the whole world, is experiencing this all at the same time. And instead of all of the low, entertainment that could, the violence that could come out in a person because of all that was presented at the very beginning, and you juxtapose that with the very end with Emily Blunt, who is this literal gift for empathy, and she ends with listen. And I do believe it's very clear. It's like, if we just took the moment to stop beating up on each other and start listening to each other, perhaps we can make our way out of the messes that we find ourselves in. And I do believe that's just very clear than what's in the film. Some other elements that I think are quite interesting that have to do with, the history of Spielberg, and that's just a thing too that I quite find interesting, is, a lot of the films that he's been making lately work a lot more if you are invested in him and his history and his filmmaking. I do not believe that they only work if you bring that with you, but I do believe that knowledge and that background gives you the keys to unlocking a lot of the layers that are in here. If you know Steven Spielberg and his history, you know that 9/11 affected him very deeply as a filmmaker. And a lot of the films that came out in the 5 years after that, change in tone quite drastically. You have Minority Report, and then, of course, more notably, Munich and War of the Worlds. War of the Worlds in particular, he said in interviews that, it's a film about 9/11. Not like on the surface, but literally it's what it made him feel. And War of the Worlds is a magnificent film as far as an exercise in horror and nihilism. A lot of the usual kind of tropes that people associate him with, which would be warmth or sentimentality, are so absent from that. The characters hardly ever really feel like characters. They just feel like just normal people, and all of these horrible events are happening to them. War of the Worlds in many ways just feels like a flat out horror film. Maybe the most, most expensive horror film ever made in that sense, because it is relentless in atrocity after atrocity. And that is the true sense of nihilism that he was filled with after the horrors of 9/11. Similarly, COVID and our response to COVID, I do believe has affected him in a similar way. Maybe not the same way, but I do believe it's kind of like kicked him into a little bit of a different gear, in which maybe instead of like being, bitter about it, he's forcing himself to be more optimistic about it, to be more hopeful. And that I think some people can relate to, because if you don't give yourself hope, how can you make it through? So here is a clip that I have from the Insession Film podcast.
And as you're talking about, ultimately a plea for empathy and togetherness, which is why in a lot of ways, I think this is Spielberg's 2020s version of War of the Worlds, in the sense that War of the Worlds is this post 9/11 allegory. And this film is clearly acting as this post COVID allegory, exploring how we live in these echo chambers that have crippled our ability to communicate and empathize with each other. An idea that has been amplified vividly since the pandemic. So I can understand why some would be disappointed with this film, because it's not at all about aliens or disclosing governmental conspiracies. All of that is just a mechanism for Spielberg to play in his thematic sandbox, as a lot of the best sci-fi movies tend to do. And I think what perhaps strikes me the most is Spielberg's patented polarity of earnestness and his 2000 cynicism. This film is full of remarkable sincerity. Spielberg's urgency for compassion and shared humanity is so full of life. It is deeply poignant, and I was very much moved by it. But at the same time, I don't think it's full-on hopecore either. We'll certainly get into this as the conversation goes, but there's a lot here with Margaret and Daniel feeling lost and discovering something larger than themselves, fostered in this non-consensual way, and they're forced to relive this traumatic childhood event that changed the course of their lives. Does that sound maybe a little familiar when we're talking about Spielberg? Perhaps it might jog the memory of a lot of people. And then there's the Noah character, who becomes a conduit for repression and misanthropy. And I know he's the antagonist, and you could just label him that way, but I think it's important to characterize him through that lens of repression and misanthropy, because of how he juxtaposes the film's ideas on faith, and ultimately how he responds in the end when apathy wins the day. Which is to say, I do think Spielberg gets to have his cake and eat it too in that regard.
I mean, I think it's pretty clear there, if like the history of Spielberg, that again, the layers upon layers, the whole traumatic event that both Kilner and Margaret shared as children, and then being forced to confront that and using that to be whole. That's literally what he went through in The Fabelmans. And then on a just the shots in particular of Kilner when he is, as a little boy, frightened terribly to death. Again, if you know the Spielberg history, as a child, that would be who he was. How scared to death he was of everything. And then in a lot of ways you have little Margaret, who's a little bit older, extending her arm out, her hand, holding hands together. That might be the shot of the movie. That shot, says so much more than just the two characters are having a moment. And it says it all, really, when you think about it. But just the idea of, an older Steven and a younger Steven kind of being in communication with each other, saying it's going to be okay. You don't have to be afraid, which also then relates to what, Margaret actually says earlier in the film, before she faints, but in the alien language, don't be afraid of what you don't know, which Kilner can translate. As a child, he says so much that Steven was afraid of everything. Everything scared him, which is funny because then he would also just scare his sisters when he would make the movies. But it is true that we don't have to be afraid of things that we don't know. And that, as far as the film is concerned, because Daniel can translate the alien language into math and then into English, is what then he'll kind of say to everybody else. The whole thing just kind of like really wraps around in there. But I really can't put into words just how moving all of this was. I can't begin to tell you how Emily Blunt's performance was transcendent for me. I mean, I feel that it began pretty great. I mean, she commanded her introduction, which was masterfully presented, but the switch up and every step of the way to get to where she goes just was, oh, you're killing it. From the moments where she's rescuing Daniel from Wardex and she just walks past everybody and then transposing, memories and giving them the gift of empathy in a way, with the beautiful John Williams music, which at times, and in particular those moments, those scenes that I was just referring to, really remind me of some of E.T.'s score, which is really interesting. Because I do feel like they're also in contact with each other. And then also, just as an aside, the John Williams score is incredible here. Like, genuinely, I think that's the best score of the year. And as usual, people just are not referring to it as such. But let's just go ahead and give Ludwig his 5th Oscar in a row for that. But when we get to, there's also the train sequence, which is wonderfully done, to the panic attack, one of the best panic attacks seen on screen, to then we get to her walking into the house, looking at her old home, and then walking into her room, putting her hand into the box of crayons, and just the feel and the touch and the memories that it comes back to Hugo revealing the experience that she and Daniel both know they have deep down, but they've been repressing, to then Margaret realizing what this was leading to, but then just the silhouettes of the cardinals, which was the cardinals were the aliens that they took those animalistic shapes to go to both of them to activate their abilities when they became adults at different points in the film, or in the timeline, if you will. But the fact that in Margaret's room, she had like cardinals like on the ceiling that would go like this, and the silhouettes on her face. Again, not enough is also talked about. The cinematography here by Janusz Kaminski. Just again, it may not be as flashy or as fancy because a lot of the locations are a bit drab. It is cold. I think it works a lot better as a bit of a fall-winter film. But there are many moments in the images that he creates, which also the Hansel and Gretel house with the animals and little Margaret walking toward it, I know has been like mocked because of its comparisons to, I guess, a Coca-Cola AI commercial. They can go fuck themselves. It's beautiful. But then when they're on, I guess, the saucer like first it's saucer like, then it's just more like a mat, if you will. They're on their backs, and the emphasis on the eyes awakening, the circular motions. That to me is what I refer to as just like classic Spielberg magic that just left me completely speechless. Every single film lately, there's a sequence where I'm just like blown away. It reminds me, I think, and people don't even mention it. I'm going to say about the Fabelmans. One of the best scenes in the Fabelmans was when Sammy is cutting the film and he's realizing, transposed with what's happening, the music. Mitzi is playing a song that in real life, his mom would play all the time, but she's just, there's so much pain coming through her when she's playing that. Sitting across from her is Paul Dano, who is doing some of his work, completely unaware of what's happening. And then in the room, Sammy is figuring it out for himself, like what really is going on between them. as it's revealed in the film that he's actually cutting. And then we have right here in Disclosure Day, when Margaret agrees to going back into her past, and she starts to remember, the tone in Emily Blunt's voice changes to a lot more melancholic, which I can relate to quite a bit. And then she starts seeing herself, and then just the moments when adult Margaret, sees child Margaret, the way that her face is both in disbelief, but then also in a little bit of just, I remember you. I used to be you. Even the song, that's also a little bit of Spielberg lore too. It's like there's a bit of an obsession with Disney songs in there, in throughout the films. When You Wish Upon a Star, and in this one, Someday My Prince Will Come. Which again, if you have the Disney brain, you forget, like, oh yeah, Emily Blunt used to be Mary Poppins, and now she's singing Snow White. Just really, the little things, right? But transpose that with the aliens coming into the room disguised as animals. And that's the other thing too. It's like they're supposed to be looking a little bit fake on purpose, but some people really do like to just take that to a little bit of an extreme degree there. But I mean, those images were striking. The performances there were brilliant. The camera work, I can't ask for anything better. I mean, that moment just made the whole film for me personally. But we're not done. There's just so many other little interesting elements in the film that are kind of like there in plain sight that don't quite, I feel, get the credit they deserve. So I'm gonna sit back here and I'm gonna let all that just come right at you, and I may chime in depending if I want to or not.
As the movie goes on, I think Emily Blunt just gets better and better. There is a huge portion of the movie where she just kind of has to be in disbelief and look at things in awe. And she does that well, but it's not asking a lot from her. But the more the movie goes on and she learns alongside the audience more about what happened to her in her past and what the source of what she can do is and what she can actually do is, the more interesting her performance becomes, the deeper her performance gets internally. And I was just riveted by that character and how she is reacting to everything that is happening around her. And the moment that really crystallized everything was when she finally meets Hugo, and she can't look him in the eye because she knows that if she does, she's going to know what he knows. And as she says, like, you are the man who knows everything, and I'm not ready to know everything yet. And the emotion with which she says that she can like barely get it out, I just found that really touching. And like some things with Courtney Grace in that final scene, it just felt so deeply human, and it really resonated with me. And that's something that I took with me out of the theater, in addition to a lot of the things that I said earlier on about, where we are as a society and the power of the cinematic image to unite us, and all these things that Spielberg wants us to take out of the theater and talk about with other people when we're out in the real world. That all was very moving and invigorating for me as I left the theater. But the pure emotion from Emily Blunt and Courtney Grace specifically that felt so deeply human, that is the thing that I'm really taking away from this movie, and the thing that makes me want to see it again and again.
I know a lot of people who had problems with the film had problems with the device and how it was used kind of in some of the criticisms I've seen, that it was used as a plot device, that it could be whatever. And I'm like, no, that's actually not my problem with the film. And that's actually, I think, a vast misunderstanding of the film, because I think it's really fascinating that the device is used by Noah to control people and to get inside their minds, and he weaponizes it. Whereas when Margaret uses it, she uses it as a shield to defend people and to help them. And it's a really fascinating dichotomy how the same object can be used so differently between these two vastly different people. And I think it shows that tension and those perspectives at odds with each other. And so I love that she has the superpower of empathy and compassion and kindness. And it also feels, what I think is really fascinating about her character, and I do think a lot of the characters are very underwritten. I think Margaret is not, and I don't know if that's because the script wrote her in a better way. I don't know if it's, solely because of Emily Blunt's acting ability and what she fleshes out here. I don't know if it's both in conjunction, whether it's also Spielberg eliciting that performance through his direction. But what I love is that even though, like, when we meet her, she's very, very lost, and she, keeps moving from town to town, and she wants more responsibility at work, but she's not really sure where her life is going to lead her. But yet when she gets this power of insight and compassion, it doesn't feel like she's a completely different person. It still feels like her. It still feels like an extension of her. And I really love that. I love that it's her, but it's heightened in this really specific way. And I think it's really, really beautiful. And I think that compassion, that thread of compassion, is obviously strewn throughout, and it weaves all the way to the end in one of the most palpable and powerful scenes, which is the news coverage that is released on Disclosure Day.
Striking scene where Noah, through the aforementioned device, possesses Jane like a demon. And there's a standoff of spiritual forces, if you will, with both characters holding what could be called a divine weapon in their hands. Noah's device, as Megan noted, it's built upon manipulation and pain and torture, whereas Jane's cross physically grounds her in her faith. For me, it is one of the best scenes of the film. The back and forth between them is pulsating, partially from a dramatics perspective, but mostly it's the spiritual warfare for me. It's Jane clutching her crucifix so hard to fight off Noah's demonic possession that it leaves a hole in her hand. I would say it's about the size of a nail. Does that make sense? About the size of a nail?
Yeah.
It's remarkable.
Yeah.
Remarkable scene. But I also think about the phone call that Jane makes to Sister Mora later on in the film.
That's a
where
great
Jane
scene.
asked Sister Mora about God and what it would mean if there was an actual discovery of aliens, or as she says in the movie, actual supreme beings, because that discovery might undermine the idea of a creator. And Sister Mora asked Jane, why would he make such a vast universe and yet save it only for us? It's a phenomenal line that takes Jane aback. Again, going back to Spielberg and what he's really wanting to wrestle here as far as the existential questions that aliens would provoke. I absolutely love that moment. But here's the kicker for me. As much as I love that exchange between Sister Mora and Jane, what really slayed me the most is right after, when Sister Mora tells Jane, you didn't lose your faith in God, you lost your faith in people. That's the exact moment I fell in love with this film. Jane didn't lose her faith. She lost her calling because of how people warped religion, treated aliens like God, and was violated by a man using a device.
So I think Eve Hewson does a great job with what she has here. I know a lot of the point of her character is she doesn't really have a character. She's more of a plot device, and I think it's totally okay. I feel like there are plenty of Spielberg films where not all the characters are actual characters or more plot devices, and it's fine. You know, a lot of Spielberg films have ensembles, but that's one of the things that I've noticed is, you know, there have been plenty of criticisms about, like, well, you know, I wanted more of this, I'm more out of there. And I mean, I get it. I do. But at the end of the day, I feel like there are many movies that do the same thing from any filmmaker. And, I guess it just depends on whether or not that you are really enjoying the ride. Because if you are enjoying the ride, such as I don't think any of this really matters. But if you're already just like not vibing with it, then, and I understand this part, then you begin to look at all the other things that are like, well, this didn't work, and I didn't care for that, and this could have been better. And I think this is where we kind of get into a bit of, I'm going to be honest with you, a bit of a mass psychosis about the reception of this script. I don't believe that David Koepp is a great screenwriter. In fact, I do believe, and I have seen, that he has written some awful, terrible screenplays. Jurassic World Rebirth was among the worst films I believe I have ever had the displeasure of seeing, and in large part because that script was dog shit on various levels. However, while perhaps the dialogue may not be the best in a film, I don't believe it's atrocious. I don't believe it's hindering the film all that much. The story is by Steven Spielberg, and David Koepp, was maybe in some ways it works better than his recent work, in large part because he was forced to rewrite it so many times. But then also, David Koepp is the definition of hit or miss. Sometimes he does somehow end up getting more out of it, and I do believe if you've seen the track record and the filmmakers that he's collaborated with, it has a lot to do with who is the director, right? So Steven Spielberg is the director here. Great movie, right? Last year, Koepp collaborated with Steven Soderbergh, Black Bag. People loved that movie. And then once upon a time, David Koepp collaborated with Sam Raimi to do the original Spider-Man. So, I mean, I do believe that it depends who the other half of that collaborator is, because if it's not someone who is talented, David Koepp may not be able to do it on his own. So, I mean, again, it's like David Koepp and Spielberg had collaborated before with War of the Worlds, with Jurassic Park, but then also with Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. So sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But I don't believe that the screenplay is a chaotic mess. I just think that it is really trying to do this really balancing tightrope, and it's not all successful all the time of all these different ideas. And I think a lot of people did not respond with not there being a definitive stance on a lot of those ideas. But I do think that was by design, by Spielberg specifically, of like, we're not going to give you those answers. You got to work them out for yourself, and you got to really grapple with what this is, because ultimately, that's what I want to do with this movie. That being said, I think one of the best sequences in the film was with Eve Hewson and with Colin Firth, who does, I want to say, one of my favorite villains in quite recent memory. I mean, Colin Firth, I've always enjoyed on screen, but he is just so delightful to see on screen, and every little line that he has and all the little moves that he makes. And then just to see him possess her, and then it even extends over, I mean, to the car chase sequence when he's using the device to kind of like get her, to, kill Daniel Kilner. All of that stuff was so good. And I do think that the character of Scanlan is an interesting villain where he's not just disposed of as if it didn't even matter. He has a role to play in the story of, that side of humanity that fears humanity, that knows that and believes strongly that this revelation will not do anything but make things worse. In fact, you could even say he's like kind of a symbol for David Koepp, who also, I think, believes the same thing. As an interesting notion how Spielberg and Koepp have different takeaways of what an event like this could mean for society, as Koepp has said in interviews himself. But then the idea that wonderful sequence in the middle where Firth and Domingo are kind of having their whole back and forth about like, what you need to stop what this is doing, this is going to destroy things, and then track that all the way to the very end of the film where he just kind of like surrenders. Okay, this is happening, do it, I'm done. But I think part of it is a little bit like, well, I guess I lost, but just again the connection that he's having with Margaret as he's looking into her eyes.
This is very Spielberg at his most self-reflexive. This is a UFO thriller. But I've said this online, but to me, if The Fabelmans was Steven Spielberg processing and reflecting upon his career and his life and his traumas as a child and his family, but also the role life
has allowed him to grapple with his art and the way art shaped him and it shapes us for good and for bad, then this movie is very much him grappling with making The Fabelmans and the traumas of The Fabelmans and the emotional difficulty of making that movie. And it's to the point where the scene where she confronts Colin Firth's character, Scanlon, and when then she leaves that little trailer center and goes person by person and meets with them, it's almost like Sammy Fabelman screening his home movies for people, but as if those home movies were made for each individual audience member. When she's taking those, like, creating those dreams of pure empathy for people, and she's inhabiting these individuals that are dead or lost or whatever the case is, it's almost like she's making movies for each of them. And the movie she played for Scanlon really confronts him and becomes his dead wife. He has a huge change, not only sometimes in what he does, but just how Firth plays him. He turns into this emotional wreck of a man. He is constantly just kind of spiraling. He looks like he just had a stroke or a heart attack the day before, and it's an emotional reaction. It's not a physical reaction to getting hit or to whatever she did. It's just he's sitting with the powerful emotional effect that it had on him. And there's this shot of him in his command center where, you know, he's just completely defeated and slumped down in his chair. And it's like a wide shot. And you just see him feeling the burden of his emotions and how they're all like whirling up inside him. And yes, he's still chasing her out of more and more desperation. But because of that arc of Colin Firth playing this character almost scene by scene, getting more and more and more just emotionally destroyed by the experience, it's like she unlocked something in him that is taking him whole little by little. I believed that at that moment in the end, he just surrendered to what was happening. It made me think of the line from The Fabelmans from Mitzi where she says, "Oh, surrendering to the score." And that's how Margaret often almost describes her experience. She's a very musical character. She's the Mitzi of the movie. And in fact, when she's having a panic attack, how does she calm down? Josh O'Connor's character, Daniel, takes her hand and puts it on a piano. And when she's talking with Wyatt Russell's character, who, for the record, I think is the weakest part of the movie, when they're talking, she's talking to him and explaining her experience in the context of music and kind of being in the right flow. And I think that's kind of an important detail because I want to kind of connect this to something really everybody was saying, but especially Gio's beautiful, description of how his dad was seeing the world right there. And also Nadia bringing up The Fabelmans. There's so much of The Fabelmans in this movie. I didn't want to get into it up front. Affected him, if you want to think about it that way. And I saw some criticism like, oh, why does it seem to affect people differently? Like, it doesn't seem to affect the henchman very much, whose name I can't remember. And I think it has entirely to do with the fact that how affected you are by it is how much you are repressing and not dealing with your feelings of loss, of difficulty, and all that stuff. And the brilliant two-hander dialogue scene between Coleman Domingo and Colin Firth, I think that scene is brilliant. I actually think Kep's script is really well written in that scene. I really like the dialogue there. I think both of them knock it out of the park performance-wise. But that's really a speech about how Colin Firth's character, how Scanlon closed himself off from the world. And that this was an avenue or an opportunity for him to re-enter it to some extent. But at the same time, this is all very interesting to me because it's also a movie, as we're talking about, with agency and control. And Emily Blunt's character, Margaret, when she's connecting with these people, she is kind of manipulating them. And she is kind of limiting their agency in those moments. They have this experience with her, and they don't just see, it doesn't seem like they're just seeing her physically as their loved one, but when she's talking to people or she's like being telepathic, it's like she's influencing them. And our villain in the movie is doing the same thing with images. And here she's doing the same thing with images by turning into someone. As I say, it's almost like she's making home movies for these people. And how it's used, I think, also connects to a major theme in the movie that Nadia and Dan were talking about, which is how much the movie is commenting on and reflecting on image culture. And because if you actually look at the movie, it's constantly surrounded by images and screens. The opening of the film, it's not just that the camera is getting attacked, which, my God, but there's a huge, obviously, display of the wrestling match being shown behind the characters. The bad guys' command center is just this huge wall, or walls plural, of screens, not just one screen, but like many, many, many screens. And the images in that section are constantly framed, so the characters are like overwhelmed and engulfed and framed around those images. Characters are constantly glancing at TVs to see that there's this World War III brewing involving North Korea, and we don't exactly know what the political context is. Spielberg withholds that as well, for better or worse. I've seen some people say that should have been a bigger part of the movie, which I understand the complaint, but nevertheless, the screens are there. But very pointedly, Colin Firth uses the alien device by studying the images of the people he's about to, quote unquote, dive into.
Right, because he needs to have a projection of them in his mind and a focus and a concentration on it in order to obtain what he wants. And I would imagine the way the device works is, if you did not have that level of intense concentration on the thing that you're desiring, that it would lead to it malfunctioning, and thus, in the case that they show a couple of times, killing him.
Right. And the thing about that is it's a movie on a literal level where the bad guys are using images to control people. Like that's not subtext. That is literally what's happening in the movie.
Right.
Granted, it's through the channel of an alien device, but that's literally what's happening. And as much as the movie is, about the power of images, perhaps in a positive sense, I really think the movie is interrogating the image culture as a whole and how it could be good or bad. And one of the things that I think is important in the movie is it begins and ends with communal events that are social. And yes, at the end, they're all staring at their screens, but these are communal events. I've seen a lot of people online, like my friend Darren Moody, compare it to like this idea of like the monoculture, and how Spielberg is showing that we need those communal social events. We sometimes need a monoculture to bring us together in a positive way, because so much of what's happening is we're consumed with the negative screen flow of data that we're constantly exposed to. And I think that's also key to what the movie is up to. And people have compared it to Minority Report. Nadia, I think you mentioned that too. And this movie has so much to do with Minority Report, because that's also a movie about how images are consuming our lives and are also controlling our lives, where characters are literally seeing images projected, and those images are controlling whether people are going to prison or not. And then, of course, it gets Tom Cruise as Anderton on his own journey. And this is a movie all about that, to me. It's all about how images are controlling us. What are positive images? What are negative images? What's Spielberg's contribution to those images? His contribution to that image culture. Are we segregated and splintered as a society now more than ever? It's very important. I think the movie takes place in the Midwest, in very kind of blue-collar spaces, in diners and wrestling matches and industrial waste areas where they're, building the home. And the movie takes place in that type of environment. So it's contrasting that like classic American way of life with the digitized, imagified, flattened culture that we're living in right now. And that device is what connects all of those things together. So, of course, the end of the movie is all about those images and how they're affecting us and how they're impacting us and whether that's good or bad. And this is, just to say quickly, that's a theme that I think Spielberg has been dealing with for much of his career, but has become especially prescient and important to him in the 21st century.
We're talking to all this detail, like we're getting so heavy into the thematical essence of Disclosure Day. we haven't really acknowledged also the set pieces that happen in this movie that still fucking rock. Like, they're so good. We touched on like the oneer that Josh O'Connor is doing, the Metal Gear Solid, sneaking around but the sound work in this movie is so unreal. When the car breaks out of the back of the house and gets into the road, unreal. Like, just some of the best sound work I've heard in a film this year, and that car chase is great. And then the train sequence, which happens, I think is so well structured, because at first I was like, oh, this is going to be like a really full-blown CG moment. And then from like one of the shots, I'm like, okay, well, this looks really real. And then they're on top. And I think it's the way Spielberg had kept kind of add notches to the intensity of it, where it's like, okay, they're on top of the car, they're trying to get out. Okay, well, another train's coming opposite. Okay, well, they could just jump. Well, they're getting shot at. Okay, then they have to duck. Well, now the car is blowing out a tire because it's caught under a train. Okay, now that's kind of preventing them from jumping off. It is like a really great moment that is mastering how to build the tension of it, keeping you engaged before it's the cherry on top. You know, it's like, oh, we're getting like a very beautiful film that is diving into all these themes, and it's like, but hey, I make very entertaining movies, I make spectacle, and it's also what keeps you in. And then also builds up to like that amazing, like, I'm so tired of panic attack scenes in movies. Watching that moment of like Emily Blunt have that, I was like, oh my god, am I about to have a panic attack? Like, that is unreal acting she's doing. Like, and in a movie where like the moment where she first goes to the news station and they're doing that long, the sweeping camera movement by Kaminsky, and then all of a sudden she's speaking Korean, and then she's dabbling back and she's unreal. But like the train sequence alone is just fantastic. I keep emphasizing, I've talked about like blocking and movement with the camera. I don't think we really just grasp how many bad movies there are today, let alone movies where just a lot of modern filmmakers just don't understand like the camera being like this entity in a way that moves, and in a way that's also not like video gamey. I know I made a joke about the oneer with Josh O'Connor, but it's more about the essence of that scene, because like you mentioned something like The Flash, and everyone talks about that CGI sequence where like the characters run up and the camera pans and it feels like you're in a transition sequence into gameplay. Like here it's, and I'm not really comparing the two, but like, you know, when I'm watching this, I thought of so much of someone like Kurosawa, who like momentum and movement is just so key in terms of, there's a great shot, I think it is in the car chase, or there's another one too when they're about to look outside a window, where the camera's moving and then there's the edit, but also the edit to the next shot is, it's still propelling it forward, not like as if it is a oneer, but in more so just like you feel the momentum of it, like it doesn't feel stalled in any way. And it's just those little things that I'm like, this is someone who's clearly been making films for such a very long time. Someone who is befriended and learned from and studied so many other greats. And seeing like, I don't want to use the word culmination, because Spielberg is someone who's very much like addicted to making movies, and it's like, I have to make movies, and doesn't really feel, unlike certain people in the industry, I have to end on a high note, or like this is a certain number. He is constantly wanting to tell stories, and you feel that in every frame, whether it works or it doesn't.
This is a filmmaker who very, very rarely has a misfire in his filmography. And I've heard a lot of people talk about how this is one. And whoever mentioned earlier in their opening thoughts that the movie almost serves as like a litmus test for how you see the world, I'm not going to say who it was, but there was one individual who I got into in the DMs pretty heated actually over this movie. And this person was trying to tell me, this is hokey. This is so unrealistic. How could he be so naive? And I pushed back on that because I just thought to myself, like you were saying earlier, Cody, if this is the way that we're going to be, that we're going to give in to such despair and division and accept that this is the way of the world and not at least try to make it better, we really have lost the plot. And I'm not saying that this would actually work, that the presentation of this truth this disclosure of information regarding extraterrestrial life beyond our planet. I do not know if it would actually work, but I do know that having basic empathy for people and how they would respond to it, and something that would unite us as a people and get us on some level of common ground, it can't hurt. It can only help. I don't know if it solves all of the issues that we have with each other, but I know that it can't hurt. So there's a lot to dive into here, I think, on a philosophical level. But on top of that, you've got a thrilling sci-fi blockbuster with 2 really high-stakes chase scenes. You've got an exceptional sound design backed by another great John Williams score. You've got a great sense of pacing in this movie, I think, for 2 hours and 20 minutes. The ensemble is very good across the board. Emily Blunt is delivering one of the best performances, if not the best performance of her career in this. There's a lot to love here. And so when I see people having this strong negative reaction to the movie based on its sentiment, and also, yeah, maybe a little bit of misguided marketing, because the movie ends maybe right where it should be beginning for some people. And it also begins at a very confusing moment where you do need to reorient yourself and reset your level of expectations regarding what the hell is happening and who are these people and what exactly did this character steal, and is Eve Houston his sister, his girlfriend, his wife? What the hell's happening, you know? But trust the process. Trust that you are in the hands of a storyteller who knows what he's doing. And I think if you give yourself over to Spielberg here, there is a lot to mine. There's a lot of riches to be found in this, but I just think some people either don't have the patience, or they just have a certain view of the world that they just refuse to engage with it on the level that the movie's asking them to engage with it on. And that is disappointing, to say the least. But hey, I do think this adds up to a kind of awe-inspiring experience that we go to the movies for. It evokes that childlike sense of wonder in all of us. And it is rare to feel that sort of a feeling, especially today, where most blockbusters that we watch, I mean, shit, we just reviewed one last week with Masters of the Universe. You know, those kinds of films do feel like they are made in a lab, focus group to death.
So hard to do these exercises with these late period films from these great filmmakers whose filmography I have a real working command of because I've spent so much time with their movies. But I think we had somewhat similar conversations about both The Irishman and Killers of the Flower Moon, where we were like, boy, these movies are really in conversation with what fascinates these filmmakers and what define their work. I do this with Clint Eastwood a lot, where I'm like, every movie that he makes now, I'm like, this is riffing on so many of the themes that he has done over the years. We talked about it with Megalopolis, and that was a movie that to me didn't rise creatively to, I think, a lot of the thematic standards that he had set. But some people disagreed. Like, we were on the more negative end of that movie, but there were some people who were like, this is what it's all about, somebody taking a swing like this. So it waxes and wanes for people. If people were like, I hate this, I understand, but it does feel, it felt like the movie got in the discourse a little bit into the same zone as Trap when that came out, where we were like, this is so fun. This is Shyamalan having a ball. But some people are like, worst movie I've ever seen, bro. And I'm like, worst movie you've ever seen?
I mean, I think some of it is also, you know, to your point, this movie like escaped containment, which is good, right?
Mm-hmm.
Enough people saw it. Spielberg went beyond even, I mean, he's Steven Spielberg. It was a big deal when you podcasted with him, but there are the Letterboxd, you know, film devotees who have seen the movies, who understand what this means. This is like part of a conversation, part of a career.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are just many people who are like, hey, I went to see an alien movie and it wasn't very good, you know? And so I saw a lot of that. And, you know, my response is always, please bore someone else with your opinions. But it's good, right? That it is reaching a wider audience, because that, like, Spielberg's, like, can still mix it up.
Yeah.
And movies can still mix it up. But yes, I agree that much of the response was like, hey, that fox didn't look real. That was stupid. Which, by the way, the fox did not look real.
It's not supposed to look real.
Yeah.
It's a generation of a memory.
That's true.
It's not a real fox. It's an alien in disguise. What are we arguing about?
But it is distracting.
Do people watch the movie?
I watched it. I did. Yes, it's true. But I bummed on that. We talked about it afterwards. And I was just like, why did they have to look like that? Even if they are meant to be a manifestation, you know, of a memory.
Do you think that a movie like this can be enjoyed in a sincere and uncomplicated way if you're not viewing it through the prism of his body of work.
Here's the thing. How do you watch that train sequence and not get like jacked up? I was so stressed out even the second time. How do you not watch all of the alien footage at the end and not feel some sort of investment? Like, you may think it's goofy at the end, and you know the comparisons to the Coca-Cola Christmas commercial are not unwarranted. Though again, that's a memory.
Yeah, and you love Coca-Cola. You're from Atlanta.
I do. That's true. But I don't understand. If you don't enjoy this, then you like a different type of entertainment than movies. That's kind of where I am.
Yeah, I generally agree. But you know what? Reasonable people can disagree.
Reasonable people can, and the other people can keep their opinions to themselves.
I think by now you get a pretty good sense of, at least I would hope anyway, of just how much really is on the screen. Part of my experiences throughout watching this many times was just watching where the camera would go. And I don't have the vocabulary or the vernacular in my mind to be able to communicate what that was or what he did. But so many, the camera is constantly moving at a very deliberate pace. And to me, that's always a really good sign that your filmmaker is as energized, still at 79 years old. I do have with me here a piece that I wanted to read that really kind of like puts all of this kind of together. So this was published on Bright Wall Dark Room. This was a piece written by Lindsay Remain. And this is what the title was called. I guess the piece was called The Speculative Empathy and Radical Hope of Disclosure Day. So I wanted to read this piece for you guys today, because I think in a lot of ways, this was kind of the final nail in the coffin that kind of like really confirmed all of what I was feeling. And I think this is the best written piece that I've encountered about this film. So here is her piece here. Sammy Fableman sits in darkness, threading strips of footage from a family camping trip through a projector. Ambrosial memories, the lightness and laughter of his sisters play fighting with sticks in the foreground, the glimmer of his mother Mitzi and family friend Benny behind them. The girls pull the focus, but there's a different story through the trees, a story that already tells its ending. Mitzi's private inner world, a subtle but objective display of intimacy with her husband's best friend, reveals itself to her son, who smells blood in the family's water as he watches more reels, collects more evidence, observing what his camera noticed before he did. Moving pictures have always been Steven Spielberg's primary way of observing and understanding the world. The Fablemans, the autobiographical story of his burgeoning love for film and the love affair that unraveled his family, is a fascinating inward look at one of our most iconic and prolific storytellers. Spielberg films are always personal, but the lens distorts exact reality. It glides in his trademark style, like air and nothing more, picking up signals along the way. But is the personal intentional here, or the byproduct of a boundlessly creative, hungry, and variegated career? It was only later, at the suggestion of James Lipton, that Spielberg realized his 1977 film, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, mimics the story of his family. His father, a computer scientist, and his mother, a musician, are like the aliens making human contact. When the spaceship lands, how do they communicate? They make music on their computers, and they are able to speak to each other. Spielberg responds tellingly, "I'd love to say, I intended that and I realized that was my mother and father, but not until this moment." Spielberg's pre-Fableman's career is chock full of personal things whose meanings synthesize the more we learn of him. Absentee fathers and parental anxieties and the loss and recapturing of faith and bravery all spoke on the Spielbergian trauma wheel. But The Fablemans reveals a shift in introspection. He observes the world, yes, but also the insularity of the individuals within it. His camera no longer a disassociative tool, but a microscope for human behavior and contradictions. By film's end, Sammy no longer blames his mother for the dissolution of her family, but instead sees her as someone complex and shadowed, an accumulation of the many beautiful things that make a person whole. His latest film, Disclosure Day, carries this self-excavated illumination into the fantastical. A movie about the revelation of extraterrestrial life on Earth and the plan to share it with the world. It's an obvious dialogue with his other alien films, but it's also the first time Spielberg's taken what the Fabelmans uncorked in him and offered it outward. The capacity to see people with the same empathy that's always defined his greatest heroes. Disclosure Day is a curious addition to the Spielbergian oeuvre, a film that initially presents as recognizable science fiction. A secretive corporation called Vortex, working alongside the U.S. Government, conceals evidence of extraterrestrial life until one of its employees, Dr. Daniel Kilner, steals footage documenting the exploitation and torture of alien beings and sets out to expose it. There are crop circles, strange animal behaviors, impossible technologies, and the dreamlike wonder that's long defined Spielberg's encounters with the unknown. But these familiar genre signifiers are a smokescreen for something far stranger. A confrontation not with alien life, but with the human capacity for empathy, embodied most fully by Kansas City meteorologist Margaret Fairchild, whose effervescent warmth and harpsichord voice become the film's moral center. Most of Spielberg's genre heroes share a blueprint. Individuals who stand up to systems of oppression or authority and are emotionally transformed by the experience. But while the institutions they reject operate as abstract forces, his protagonists see the human beings paying the cost. In Jaws, Mayor Vaughn is the embodiment of greed, more concerned with summer profit than the safety of his constituents. But Chief Brody sees the particulars, gore in the water from 2 recent shark attacks. In Jurassic Park, John Hammond sees dinosaurs as awe-inducing attraction and a vehicle for capital. But Alan Grant, the paleontologist he hires to recommend his park, sees the danger of resurrecting dormant science and Hammond's grandchildren in peril. In Saving Private Ryan, military command reduces James Ryan to a dot on a map. But Captain Miller sees the young man behind the orders and the lives already sacrificed in their attempt to reach him. What's the shared word here? See. These characters see people, but they also see through the methods of control that erode our compassion. It's a device as convenient as it is telling of Spielberg. The naivete he is sometimes accused of is always countered by his resignation of human failure. His adult-centered films are not definitionally sentimental. They don't favor tender emotionality over logic, but use logic as a bedrock for hope. Institutions provide safety and complacency, but safety and complacency make us apathetic. Spielberg's small hopes are countered by world weariness. The townspeople agree with the mayor. Open the beach. Kids be damned. Hammond won't abandon his dinosaur project and causes more destruction in the lost world. Brody and Grant are disruptors, but evil still corrupts. In AI Artificial Intelligence, one of Disclosure Day's most interesting links, humans enable the technology that will destroy them. They create robots capable of love, then reject them for loving too much. There is nothing naive about such a worldview. We're living through the proof of it. There is also nothing to imply sentimentalism in its flaw. Kubrick, who originated the project, also conceived its emotional conclusion, not Spielberg. Both men synthesized the same idea. We create the conditions of our own misery and inflict it elsewhere. We summon life. We summon extraterrestrial life and abuse it for self-interest. Spielberg's pessimism necessitates the hope his characters hold against impossible change. It also necessitates the hope he searched for himself, in himself, and found in the Fabelmans. By honing observation, directing it inward, and stepping through the lens, his own tool of safety, he was able to curate a purer form of empathy as a key to self-betterment. It's easier to empathize when you loosen institutional shackles and look deeply into people, especially yourself. In Disclosure Day, Spielberg's camera is Margaret Fairchild, An ordinary woman made extraordinary by the extraterrestrial gift of embodying human empathy. The aliens abducted her as a child and imbued her with the power to give others what they're given. What they've given her. Tenderness as an elixir for despair. She is their thought experiment. Will her ability to present herself as dead loved ones or speak in every other language or gently connect with others via psychic understanding prevent earthly cataclysm and abuse and the end of the abuse of outsiders? Disclosure Day never definitively answered these questions. Kellner and Fairchild, with the assistance of others, including Kellner's girlfriend Jane and fellow Wardex defector Hugo Wakefield, returned to KCXE and disclosed the footage in a broadcast that goes international. Within moments, the entire world learns that the U.S. government has known about alien life since the Roswell crash and has shielded this knowledge from the public. We see a montage of the global response. Families in their living rooms, people on airplanes and on trains and in the streets, the communal witnessing of a cover-up that exposes humanity's cosmic reality. Sammy Fableman's perception is forever altered by revelatory footage, and theirs will be too, no matter how they respond to it, which we purposefully never see. Margaret Fairchild is a new kind of Spielberg hero. She doesn't stand up to a system, that's Kellner that does that. Rather, she steps through it into something deeper. She passes on the alien's message for us. Listen. World War III is about to erupt. Nukes may soon be dropped, but empathetic communication could be a solution if enough ears hear it. It's a fantastical suggestion in times like these. The world spins chaotically, and humans are powerless to stop it. Individualism is the only self-protection we know, but it's a rotten place to live. Corrosive to our very spirit. But still, we fight and hate what we don't know. We fight and hate what we don't know. Even the progressives among us, opposition to any core belief is a threat. For most of Spielberg's career, science fiction has been the mechanism through which he learns and teaches empathy. But in Disclosure Day, empathy itself is the speculative leap. Empathy itself is the speculative leap. The genre function is inverted. Science fiction stops speculating about aliens and starts speculating about us. Aliens are ordinary. Human compassion is extraordinary. The sci-fi is us. Disclosure Day is only a month old as of this writing, but its response is already the narrative. Reactions were divisive, but also oddly spiteful. Negative word of mouth likely affected its box office. Critics were mixed positive, but audiences have brandished their anger for its script issues and character development, and especially its ending. It's fascinating to watch hostility lodged at an earnest message of hope. Disclosure Day is imperfect. There are some thorny knots of inelegant plot and a few too many vague relationships between characters. Stakes can feel unclear at times, and dialogue is muddy in places where clarity is essential. But while subjectivity is the beauty of film, it's good for the soul of a movie to inspire some friction. A pattern has emerged in the broader feedback, and a dispiriting one at that. Not merely the rejection of imagined hope, but the accusatory nature of it. The response to Disclosure Day is reminiscent of Munich, another widely divisive Spielberg movie. Munich is the opposite of science fiction. It's starkly of the now, despite releasing 20 years ago. Munich is set in the aftermath of the 1972 Munich massacre, when 8 members of the Palestinian militant organization Black September killed 2 members of the Israeli Olympic team and took 9 others hostage. After the hostages were killed during a failed rescue attempt, an Israeli assassination team led by Avner Kaufman is hired to hunt down those believed to be connected to the attack. Rather than celebrating vengeance, Spielberg uses the mission to interrogate the moral and psychological cost of answering violence with more violence. It's a film that looks directly at cycles of revenge and nationalism and inherited trauma, but proffers no solution. The lack of resolution is the point. But humans are uncomfortable with ambiguity, even as a narrative tool. Answerable dilemmas lead to existentialism and anxiety, or to extremes like religious hysteria and conspiracy. We are incapable of accepting the most basic principle of life, that its greater meaning exists in its intangibilities. Where do we come from? Why do we exist? What is our purpose? We'll never know. That's part of our story. But even in fiction, a lack of specificity inspires wrath. Munich was controversial for both sides in the devastating and ongoing Israeli-Palestinian war, but it's a simplification that ignores the larger Spielberg project. Is someone who spent decades depicting human darkness politically and naively disengaged? It's hard to imagine an unconvicted person making Munich. It's even harder to imagine another mainstream director touching the subject with a 10-foot pole. There's nothing gutless in his approach. His cinema is theater. Audience participation required. Ambiguity is not passivity. Utilized purposefully, it has even more to say. That's true of his genre FAIRE as well. Close Encounters is about as ambiguous as it gets. We never learn where the aliens are come from or what they really want or whether they're even good or bad. It's an enduring classic because the ambiguity is disguised as wonderment. But if it came out today, its autopsy might reveal what Disclosure Days has: an audience unwilling to surrender to unreality. But science fiction is always unreal, rooted in scientific possibility, not actuality. It's a genre that's often functioned as a place to imagine better social arrangements than the ones that currently exist. In Close Encounters, first contact inspires awe, not fear, just a few years after Watergate. In Metropolis, class reconciliation creates a better social order at the height of industrialization. In The Day the Earth Stood Still, an alien visitor probes humans to stop destroying themselves. In the early days of the Cold War. In Interstellar, familial love saves humanity from climate extinction, as California experienced one of its worst ever droughts. In Arrival, language overcomes political hostility the same year Trump became president. Disclosure Day operates with the same speculative hope, but was received much differently. The mechanics of the disclosure seem to be the highest sticking point. Why would global news networks pick up or even believe a report from a small Kansas City station? The proposition is no hokier than love will solve climate change, or a language that triggers time travel will create world peace. Fritz Lang was not naive for make-believing hope, just like Gene Roddenberry wasn't when he imagined Star Trek, right as the Vietnam War was escalating, and the Cold War was defining global politics, and the civil rights movement was reshaping the country. His post-scarcity, post-racial future was a bomb and remains one. But dreaming of a reality where the world hits pause to collectively empathize with outsiders, that's a bridge too far? Are we so absent of hope in 2026 that even the suggestion of it triggers us? Modern audiences seem to evaluate stories based on whether they accurately model reality instead of what they illuminate about us. Optimism is asked to justify its existence, and if the audience recoils at the idea that humanity might collectively choose compassion, maybe Spielberg was never the naive one. Maybe, with Disclosure Day, he accurately diagnosed the problem we refuse to. We sit in darkness watching Disclosure Day like Sammy in his bedroom, the gentle whir of a projector now silently digital. But it still speaks the same language, one Spielberg taught many of us in the first place. The filmmaker who dared us to dream is now inviting us to take another leap of imagination, to see and listen and move with compassion before it's too late. Whether we accept the invitation, well, that says more about us than it does him. Margaret Fairchild, in her practical shoes and sun-yellow sweater, is all of us. Traumatized children with anxiety disorders wishing we were somewhere else. But she's something more too. Not a Brody or a Grant, individual cogs in a greed-driven system using hope as a cudgel. She's an observer of the weather and the news and the people around her, aware of and affected by it all, an embodiment of empathy and a tether back to ourselves. Spielberg's lens, but also Spielberg himself, taking their lessons and suggesting something better, looking through the darkness and imagining light. In The Fabelmans, Spielberg learned that art can alter perception. We may have grown beyond the cinematic language and pop culture landscape he created, though it's funny to suggest his irrelevance when he'll never and cannot be irrelevant. But now, he's gifting us something new. A science fiction that isn't asking us to imagine aliens, but to imagine ourselves differently. And with that, and as we wrap this up and close up this conversation on this movie, I have one more clip here from the Big Picture podcast, in which Sean Fennessy says something that I think a lot of people might laugh at, quite frankly, but here is what he says.
West Side Story Fableman's Disclosure Day. Would like to see how many filmmakers in their 70s have a trio that good. It's gonna be a short list. It's gonna be a short list because all three of those films feel monumental to what he's trying to communicate as a filmmaker.
Yeah,
and
they were getting like more of those. Like I just impulsively.
They're just so infrequent. It's like Coppola's made one movie. Scorsese is obviously.
I mean, I just googled Scorsese because you've got Silence, Irishman, and then
Killers of the Flower Moon.
Yeah.
Now I don't know if I actually said this to you, but this is kind of his Killers of the Flower Moon.
I totally agree.
Or it's like, what am I really about?
Yes, it's the end. Like it's the end of career.
What am I really about? And I think that kind of brings this film and what it's trying to say in a large, broader text. And it's in very good company with films that not just are speaking to the times that we live in, but are very desperately trying to shake us and move us to grow beyond what we have in many ways resigned ourselves to be, lesser than what we know we can and have been. I think it's in great company with films like Killers of the Flower Moon, like Oppenheimer, like The Odyssey, One Battle After Another. All films that Sinners, Wake Up Dead Man, even Avatar Fire and Ash had some fury in there that was very much relevant to a lot of the frustrations that we have right now in society. So many movies now speaking to the idea that we're in really a place of inhumanity. Atrocities happening all over the place. And that we just let it happen. I don't want people or us to believe that we can't move beyond it. And I don't want to dismiss the films, some of which were in the company that I just read off, that are saying that it's hopeless, that it's over, that we can never move beyond the worst parts of our nature. And perhaps that's true. More than likely, that is true. And we are correct, I would say, to acknowledge the evil that exists in our world, the power they command, and the hopelessness that we feel moving through this world day in and day out. And while I know there will be many people who would laugh at the suggestion that Disclosure Day belongs in the same company as The Odyssey or Flower Moon or One Battle, they're wrong. It's very much speaking with all of those films and in turn speaking to us. And perhaps, and I know very much they're not taking the same approach, and in some instances they may be offering different perspectives. But with Steven Spielberg, I think it's a mistake to label it boomer core or boomer hoping. It's more so, I think he is a remarkably with it person. And I feel and I believe that despite all of what we have already lived through, it's not impossible for us to be united again. And I think ultimately that's the point. But also, more depressing, I guess, takeaway from that film is we can't do it ourselves. Maybe we can't. Maybe the film was also him just like, you know what? It's going to take aliens doing this psyop to get to a point where their revelation and their, shall we say, their gifted person can then transmit and transfer empathy all over the world. The kind of maybe a little bit more of a twisted take is it kind of does a Smile 2 ending where in Smile 2, the Smile Demon kind of like is inhabiting this pop star and she's killing herself in a concert that's being live streamed throughout the world. And that in turn is going to spread that disease all throughout it. And then that'll end it. In some ways, it kind of reminds me a little bit of the inverse of that, where here we have Emily Blunt who has the gift, and anybody who sees her immediately feels this empathy that's been so buried down, but then coming up to the surface. And perhaps in a more, I guess, a cynical read of the film would be that the aliens had to come down and they had to do it because we were literally about to kill ourselves, at least in the context of that film. And it took an imbued, enhanced person, if you will, to get us to remind that deep down we have a humanity, to the humanity within ourselves to be brought up, back up to the surface. But that could only be done at this moment when the whole world is watching, where as many people are watching, and we have our gifted person here to just do it ourselves. Because if left to our own devices, we will destroy ourselves. So this has been ridiculously long. I don't believe I've ever had the, I don't know if you call it pleasure or displeasure of having your attention, if anyone even made it to the very end of this, when it's just me, myself, and I. But this is a film that, as you can tell from this exacerbated conversation, if you will, that has just really, it hits deep, resonated deeply. Perfect companion piece with the Fablemans, as is the Odyssey, a perfect companion piece with the Oppenheimer, as we will discuss in the next week. I will be the only, I guess, voice out there that will kind of equate them in an instance here. The rest of you can have what you want to have and laugh what you want to laugh at. Please do that. But just in a way that Spielberg had to make Fablemans and Disclosure Day to kind of like exercise this out of his system, I had to just come on here and get all this off my chest, because I have been, all of these thoughts have been gestating for well over a month now. And I do feel like the other conversations didn't quite cut it as far as like getting to the heart of what the magic and the beauty of the film really is. And now I think we've come to a place where I finally got it all out there, got it off my chest. My thoughts are out there. It's over. It's done. To me, it's very clearly the movie of the year, in a year filled with so many wonderful stories. I have a feeling, as with the Fablemans, it'll be an instance in which very soon people are going to be like, perhaps we treated you too harshly. There will always be the detractors, but I know it deep down, and I knew it from the very instant I saw it, that yeah, this is the same story all over again. A new Spielberg comes out, it's kind of either treated with, it's a movie, or it's awful, or it's like, yeah, whatever. But interestingly enough, how a lot of people are like coming to the Fableman's defense now. When it came out, people were bemoaning the idea that it could actually win. Didn't win. But in a lot of ways, it did end up winning more hearts by it losing. I maintain that if it had won, the knives would be out forever, forever, and forever. And I do think that this film is a work of art. It has an amazing ensemble cast, an amazing crew. And at the core there, Emily Blunt, I think, gives a truly transcendent performance. And I think truly she is the one of the year that had to work with a lot of different, a lot of material for sure, and a lot of different tones. But she commands the screen. She is a star. And I do hope that at the very least, she is not forgotten as far as like where we go later on in the year. But thank you all very much for staying with me, if you indeed did stay with me. I have a feeling that this particular film and the ideas that are communicated will not soon fade away. Thank you all for watching, listening. Stay under our spotlight, because in a lot of ways, the part 2 of this conversation is next week with The Odyssey, the film that I know all of you can't get enough of, myself included. All right. Thank you so much, and we will see you next time, guys. Bye-bye.